The way that these startups create paradigm shifts in areas is something that life sciences really needs, because we're constantly now having to deal with creating a paradigm shift to be able to create the impact that we want clinically and from a health standpoint. Well, I want to welcome you to the Truth to Strategy podcast. I'm Ray Bascaron. I'm the founder of Veritas, and we wanted to do something a little different. We wanted to help change some minds.
So hi, and I'm Kerri Phillips. And so we wanted to change some minds with our company, but also we thought we'd share some of those ideas through a podcast. So why a podcast? Well, in this day and age where we're all over the place all of the time trying to figure out, when to squeeze some little knowledge nuggets in. And so, this podcast will be accessible to you, whenever you need, whether it's, just as a fresh perspective or, when some of these business questions, are poised to you, you can reflect on some of the things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, great resource to share with your team if you ever need it. And the reason behind it is that we've realized that there's a place in life sciences where we need strategy with more weight behind it. We need things that are tested, things that are true, hence truth to strategy. When we look at Veritas S, that translates in Latin to the truth is. And what we came to realize is without that truth, we can't really address the needs of customers in the marketplace. And so what we want to do is come up with research approaches that fit what the customer needs even more and really drives what it means to have a strategy that finds product market fit, that helps really make a customer desire what it is that a company is manufacturing.
So I guess why, what is it that drove us to seek inspiration from, outside the life sciences industry?
Yeah, a lot has been going on in the past few decades in life sciences. I don't know if you noticed, but if you go back to the early 2000s, we were looking at approaches and tactics like reach and volume. We were looking at commonplace Me Too launches. We were looking at a world where you could fulfill some type of unmet need through the lens of what was in your company's medicinal pipeline, as opposed to looking at it from the lens of purely what the customer needed. What happened was the analytics and insights industry followed approaches that fit the needs in the 2000s. A lot of those are things that we still do today. The marketplace has changed, but the approaches have not.
I know it's interesting. You think about the products that launched back then and they truly sold themselves, right? I mean, there was a huge market for it. You could launch and have a very successful Me Too. You didn't really have to be very creative when it came to, talking to your patients or talking to your physicians even, right? You just put it in their hand, you built it and they came. It's different. It's a different marketplace now. So it's really important to know like what is going on in the heads of our holistic customer, the patients, the physicians, the payers.
Yeah, there's a lot of people in the room. And quite frankly, what we were doing, I know we both agree on this, got very stale. So when we think about that, we think about particular methods that needed to be advanced. Very, very key one here, episode 3, catch what we talk about on segmentation. This is the flaw in it, is that every one of them ends up with a very similar construct of segments, very little differentiation in behavior, maybe some meaningful differences in attitudes and beliefs. And it's time to look at something different.
I mean, I have worked on dozens and dozens of segmentations in my career, and they were all brilliant, obviously. But the way that the output came in the end, it was almost more of a beautiful academic exercise, right? We would have these segments that were, easily identifiable and made a lot of sense, but they weren't very fresh. And it's because we were constantly asking the same questions and expecting different segments to somehow emerge.
Yeah. Speaking of asking the same question, demand assessment. I know we're not dropping an episode on this, but in the 2000s, this is a great way to look at the change from the 2000s to today. Demand assessments were allocation based. And that was great because you had high prevalence diseases where a physician's behavior could be summarized in an allocation. your next 100 patients.
Right. Well, like think about diabetes, right? It was easy to say, like, think about your next 100 diabetes patients that walked in. And you could really think about that. But now, we're focused on so many different rare diseases and, specific biomarkers and, the patient populations that we're talking about, might not even be 100 patients that the physician sees in their entire career. So it doesn't make sense to have them think about, treatment in terms of percentages when it really is becoming such more of a focus on personalized medicine.
Yeah. When a physician wakes up in the morning, they think about the next patient they're going to treat, not the next 100.
Yeah.
And so our approaches and our methods need to match up with that.
Although they're so busy that they probably are thinking about how they're going to physically see their next 100 patients.
Well, usually it's 20 that day these
Yes.
days, right? We'll talk about that in a moment, how that's part of the paradigm that's changing. But clearly, some of this doesn't work anymore. The question is, why Silicon Valley? Why was that the source of our inspiration?
Was it only because you were out in California?
Not only, but when I moved out to the West Coast, I started seeing something different. I started realizing that the way we approach things in life sciences was not nearly as understanding of the customer as what startups in Silicon Valley does. In pharma and life sciences, we have a very stable way of developing products, a very regulated way. So we all develop most products through 3 phases of clinical trials. Some exceptions here and there, oncology and early access type programs. But when we look at Silicon Valley, they have a much less regulated way. And so they have to come to know their customer much better. When we look at our patients today in the environment they live in, the patients are much more empowered, much more informed. We see them getting a ton of information from TikTok. And I think between me and you, we had 3 studies last week where we had like tremendous insights about TikTok for some reason.
Yeah, this is like the first time in my life where I feel like I'm like older because I'm like, I don't know who is going to like the internet for their information like this. But yeah, I've spent a lot more time researching TikTok in the last week than I ever thought I would be.
And it's driving customers and it's driving patients' decisions about their care. It is phenomenal to see the world changing and our customers change in it, but our methods aren't catching up quite yet.
Well, and it's really interesting just when we talk about customer, right? We're sort of using it interchangeably for patients, physicians, for payers, any one of those key stakeholders. And I think that, even when I started my career, when I thought about the customer, it was the physician, right? That was sort of the primary pharmaceutical company customer, because, we had to, put it in their hands and then they were almost going to sell it to the patient for us. But I think because physician offices are so crowded and because, there is so much more awareness of more rare diseases and patients are so much more in tune based on, whether it be their genomic testing that they're getting done through 23andMe or whatever the case may be, they're so much more aware of all of this medical information that's specific to them that they've had to really become a very knowledgeable patient advocate and have become much more our direct customer than I think we used to think about.
I think our physicians are becoming nuanced in the decisions they're making, and they're being forced to. Payers are being much more specific about the needs being met, what they're approving. We're seeing patients encounter affordability challenges that physicians are very aware of. And in addition to that, the products coming to market are categorically different than what was earlier. And so when we look at more products coming through the 505(b)(2) pathway, when we look at clinical trials becoming geographically dispersed, when we look at the amount of patients being treated through telehealth, we see a very different change in the way payers, patients, and physicians are actually taking action. So when we look at that, when we see these paradigm shifts, that takes you back to Silicon Valley. The geographic area in California, and extended more further than that these days. But the way that these startups create paradigm shifts in areas is something that life sciences really needs, because we're constantly now having to deal with creating a paradigm shift to be able to create the impact that we want clinically and from a health standpoint.
I mean, you think about though the way that Silicon Valley is able to, iterate and learn and relaunch constantly. It's very different than the life sciences, right? About how we would typically think about it, because we would say, well, there is such a specific, phased process in terms of developing a product, and B is always come after A, and this is just how it's always been done. And so you don't think of an iterative approach when you're talking about developing life sciences products. And so I think that, a lot of what we talk about is how can we help, create an iterative way to test these new products through research. And so, whether it be, message testing or product design, through our research, we really have been focusing on, being able to do that growth hacking, if you will, where we, launch an idea, update, and then continue to move on in a safe place, right? So, because what you want to do is, what do you always say?
I always say, fail without fear, launch with success, right? And as a team, we're hyper focused on creating that environment for clients to really test out their thoughts and to actually bring the organization together. We discussed those silos. There's a silo between clinical and commercial, and there's a reason for that actually. But there's also a silo between sales and marketing. There's a silo between, the way even market research might think with marketing. How do we bring the organization together in a very compliant way to really understand what a customer needs, meet that desire, and then develop that desire, right? And that might be your clinical trial and the design of your product. And it might be all the way through even things like your detail aid and your promotional tactics and your email strategy and approach, right? Finding the way that the customer wants to consume the solution you're offering is critical because that will drive their behavior.
And I think that there's a plug for, is it episode 4 in there too, where we talk about clinical trial design and using this approach. And I think that we've had a lot of success, very early in clinical design, where maybe you're not typically thinking about market research, but really going out and talking to the customer, showing them, early stage TPPs and saying, is this really what you want to be seeing? What is it that you want to see?
Yeah. We'll dive into growth hacking more, as Kerri said in episode 4. But then there's one last piece about the mentality of Silicon Valley that is critical to bring across. It's the agnostic feeling that they have to their internal politics and what they want the product or what they want the company to be. And they have this laser focus on the desire of the customer. That helps create product market fit. It keeps things pure. It keeps them hyper focused. It prioritizes what they do ruthlessly and allows them to focus on iterating and making the solution or the product better, as opposed to getting lost in their own internal politics. That's critical. And I know we've all felt that in our roles, both internal in pharma and external as consultants and researchers to our clients. So that's something to look out for too, as we cover 3 more episodes that kind of give great examples of all this. We talked about one way, growth hacking. Let's hop to another one.
So another one is, I think, moving beyond the explicit and thinking about the implicit. And so oftentimes we take things very much at face value. And I know that we talk a lot in the industry about, derived importance and focusing not only on what, the physician is saying, but what they're actually doing. And I think that even some of that is a little bit face value because we're looking at, behavior in aggregate. Whereas I think that, something that we'll keep circling back to is like these one-to-one decisions and one patient at a time and one specific decision. Because the prescribing decision isn't the only decision a physician is making throughout the day, right? Or even in the 3 minutes that they might be with a patient. There's a bunch of different decision points that are being made, which we'll talk about. But I think that, at each of those decision points, it's not only, yes, I'm picking this product because it's efficacious, but there's a lot of other things going on. Is it how busy the physician is that day, the time of practice that they're in? Is it, the time of day, who they just saw last, how long they've seen this patient? There's just so many other factors that are coming into play that are almost just as important for us to understand when talking about these products, because we can't only be focused on product benefits anymore.
Yeah, a huge one also is their emotion. We'll actually share in episode 2, we'll actually share an emotion that was impacting the care of patients, an emotion that the clinician was experiencing that resulted in a difference in what happened to the patient, right? Capturing those things, capturing the things that they can't directly tell us is so, so critical. So we shared about growth hacking. We shared a little bit about, this implicit, explicit that ties into our behavior board for episode 2. And then we want to cover one more here, the importance of doing this throughout the life cycle.
Yeah. And I think we talked about that a little bit before. Like, again, we've always sort of thought about research, like starting, what is it, like 2 years before launch or something. But now we're starting to think about so much earlier, even preclinical. So I think that's been like, a huge change in my mindset the last few years is like, when should we really start thinking about market research? So I think in the clinical design, then when we're actually, in clinical development, are we really getting ahead of like what our customers are going to be reacting to when they see this? What sort of questions are they going to have? From their perspective, not what we're hypothesizing, they're going to be important to them in a Q&A page, but like, what is it that they're really thinking about? Because I do often see that, it's what comes out of research is different than what we would have assumed. And then lastly, even when the product hits the market, what is the experience that the physician is having with the product? And that, is not only how is the patient, benefiting from the product, but it's how does it make the physician feel? How does it make the physician feel when the patient has trouble accessing this product? And then based on those feelings, are they ever going to prescribe our product again? Because it has to be, a positive experience from start to finish in order to become, the go-to product.
Yeah, that's spot on. It's there's a lot of factors that play into it. And then there's even this notion of how they gear their practice to facilitate the continuation of that behavior, right? And so all those things are things that we want to cover over the next few episodes here. So we really want to encourage you to follow on LinkedIn or subscribe to the email list, so that way when episode 2 drops, and all the others. But in that vein, a lot of learnings. We're going to go deeper. I know this is kind of an intro here, but we want to go deeper. We want to show real cases, real efforts, real changes and approaches throughout those next 3 episodes. Because ultimately, we don't want to become an industry that underserves the patient. We want to be an industry that is doing all we can for the health of the patient. So we encourage you to tune in to check that out. And we can't thank you enough for tuning into this first episode.
All right.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.